She was the original it girl, bold, beautiful, and dangerously ahead of her time. But was Zelda Fitzgerald a muse? Or a woman robbed of her own legacy? Long before she was labeled crazy, she was setting New York and Paris on fire. So, what really happened to the dazzling Southern belle who danced too close to genius? Southern belle with a wild streak, Zelda's early years. Zelda Sayre was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1900. Her family was deeply rooted in Southern tradition, the kind that placed a strong emphasis on manners, lineage, and quiet elegance. Her father, Anthony Sayre, sat on the Alabama Supreme Court, and her mother, Minnie, came from a well-respected background. In a town like Montgomery, names mattered, and Zelda's was known in every corner. From a young age, Zelda didn't act the way girls from good families were expected to. Where others sat politely at luncheons or practiced piano behind closed doors, she chased excitement. She was loud when she wanted to be, flirted shamelessly, and had no patience for the slow, quiet routines of Southern womanhood. Her energy was electric. So, as a teenager, she became the star of every social gathering, whether she was invited or not. Her name popped up regularly in Montgomery's local gossip columns, usually tied to something scandalous. Once, she showed up at a formal event with her dress hemmed well above her knees, a bold move in a time when ankles were still a taboo topic in polite circles. Another time, she was spotted swimming with boys at a public lake, laughing loudly and making no effort to hide it. Zelda just didn't care about rules. She had this deep belief that she was meant for something bigger than tea parties and church picnics. Her classmates saw her as the life of the party, but she felt different from everyone around her. She was fascinated by the idea of living a full, dramatic life. Her imagination ran wild with thoughts of cities far from Alabama, of theaters, music, and stories that didn't end with marriage and babies. Some called her reckless. Others called her magnetic. Local boys had a name for her, the wild child of Montgomery. It wasn't said with disapproval. It was said with awe. Zelda had no interest in being a Southern belle in the traditional sense. She rolled her eyes at girls who measured their lives in bridal showers and corsage ribbons. She wanted drama, fame, and movement. She wasn't waiting around for a husband to come and build her a house. She was looking for the next thrill, the next scene, the next story to live in. Montgomery wasn't built for someone like her. It was a quiet, slow-moving town where everyone knew everyone else's grandparents. Zelda's energy pushed up against the walls of that town like steam in a locked kettle. She had no real outlet for it, so she poured it into theater, dance, poetry, and rebellion. Every rule she broke seemed to give her more confidence. She wasn't afraid of being talked about. She enjoyed it. Her teachers often said she was brilliant but unmanageable. She could write beautifully and speak like a natural actress, but she refused to follow classroom routines. She'd skip homework and then recite Shakespeare from memory. When told to behave like a young lady, she'd respond with sarcasm and mischief. Zelda didn't believe in shrinking herself to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. She also had a complex relationship with her family. Her mother encouraged her creative side but struggled to rein her in. Her father, the stern and traditional judge, didn't know what to do with a daughter who refused to play by the rules. He was used to order, discipline, and quiet respect. Zelda gave him none of those. Their relationship was strained, with Zelda often feeling misunderstood or trapped. By the time she reached her late teens, she had built a reputation that stretched beyond Montgomery's social circles. Her name carried weight. People told stories about her, some true, some wildly exaggerated. She had become a local legend, and she loved it. Every sideways glance or whispered comment only added fuel to her fire. But underneath the glitter and chaos, Zelda was always searching. She was looking for someone or something that could keep up with her. Someone who didn't flinch when she broke the rules. Someone who could look her in the eye and challenge her in return. She didn't want safety, she wanted intensity. She wanted to feel like her life was moving at the speed of her thoughts. Even in quiet moments, when she was alone with her writing or sketching in her notebook, there was a restlessness to her. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be known for something extraordinary. She wanted more than the world around her was offering. And then came the war. Young soldiers were everywhere, handsome, restless, full of stories about cities and battles and futures that seemed far more exciting than anything Montgomery could offer. The world felt like it was about to change, and Zelda was ready to be at the center of it. The Golden Pair, Zelda meets F. Scott Fitzgerald. Zelda Sayre was already a local sensation in Montgomery. She flirted with danger, disobeyed curfews, and danced barefoot at parties, all while keeping the attention of Montgomery's most eligible bachelors. But none of them thrilled her quite like the young Army lieutenant who showed up at a country club dance in 1918. His name was Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, and from the moment he laid eyes on Zelda, he knew he was in trouble. Scott didn't just want Zelda, he needed her, the Southern belle who moved like she didn't care what anyone thought. She was beautiful, bold, and unpredictable, and he fell fast. He told her he was writing a novel that would make him rich and famous. She didn't exactly buy it. To her, he was charming but broke, and she didn't want to marry someone whose future was just a possibility. While Scott chased his publishing dreams from New York, Zelda stayed in Alabama, dating others and keeping her options open. He sent her letters filled with promises, but she wasn't the kind of girl to settle for potential. Then in 1920, everything changed. His debut novel, This Side of Paradise, hit shelves and became an overnight success. Suddenly, the young man from Princeton was a literary star, and Zelda was back on the train to New York. Within days of the book's release, the two were married at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Just like that, Zelda became Zelda Fitzgerald, the wife of America's newest celebrity author. With their good looks, wild antics, and lavish lifestyle, the Fitzgeralds quickly turned into a media obsession. Newspapers ran photos of Zelda in flapper dresses, puffing cigarettes and smiling like she had nothing to lose. Reporters followed them through New York's best clubs and most exclusive hotel suites. It wasn't unusual to read about them jumping into fountains or showing up drunk to black tie parties. Their recklessness made headlines, and the public ate it up. Zelda was no background figure. She was the it girl of the moment, funny, brilliant, and unapologetically wild. Even in a city full of bright young things, Zelda stood out, and Scott loved being seen with her. He used and admired her beauty, her words, her wit, her style. They all ended up in his writing. At parties, he introduced her like a co-author to his life. But what started as admiration would later turn into something more complicated. In their early years, though, they lived in hotel rooms instead of homes, danced until morning, and drank like the world might end tomorrow. Their money came fast and disappeared even faster. They burned through publisher advances on champagne, jewelry, and travel. But for a while, it didn't matter. As long as they were seen, adored, and talked about, they felt untouchable. Zelda became the blueprint for Scott's female characters. Daisy Buchanan, Rosalind Connage, and Gloria Gilbert were all cut from her image. Her voice was woven into his dialogue. Her letters, phrases, and even her jokes appeared in his novels. Some people noticed, others didn't. Either way, Scott didn't stop. To the outside world, they looked like a couple in sync, two minds working as one. But underneath the shine, that balance was already off. Their fame came with a price. Everywhere they went, the Fitzgeralds were expected to perform. They played their roles as the glamorous couple, even when they weren't speaking to each other. Every smile became a photo op, every kiss a headline. And though they were still young, the constant attention made them feel much older. They traveled to Long Island for the summer scenes, booked hotel rooms for writing retreats that ended in parties, and circled in and out of the most exclusive social circles in Manhattan. Scott made more money, wrote more stories, and pushed Zelda further into the spotlight, even as their private life got messier. But none of that was public knowledge yet. Back then, it was all jazz clubs, champagne, and first editions. Zelda became the icon that women copied. She bobbed her hair, wore silk headbands, and posed for photographers with the kind of grin that said she knew more than she'd tell. For a moment, they weren't just famous, they were envied. But behind the flashing lights and champagne toasts, their relationship had cracks that even early fame couldn't hide. A marriage fueled by fire, passion, jealousy, and control. Zelda didn't come into the marriage quietly. She was bold, witty, and deeply ambitious in her own right. But from the beginning, it was clear that Scott expected to be the only star in their shared spotlight. He would often read her private letters and diary entries, then lift entire lines, sometimes full paragraphs, and work them into his novels and short stories. When The Beautiful and Damned came out in 1922, the comparisons between the characters and their real-life counterparts were too obvious to ignore. Zelda even wrote her own review, accusing Scott of lifting their marriage scenes straight from her diary, but Scott brushed it off, claiming their lives were intertwined. His art couldn't help but include her. To him, it was an inspiration. To her, it felt like erasure. Even as Scott's fame grew, he grew more possessive. He wanted her under control. When she showed interest in writing, painting, or anything creative, he discouraged it unless it served his work. The moment her voice gained independent recognition, he pushed back. One editor once praised a piece Zelda had written, and Scott reacted not with pride, but with disdain. He told her not to waste time on ideas that made people think she was an artist. The message was clear. Only one of them was allowed to succeed, and it wasn't going to be her. Their arguments weren't private either. Wherever they went, New York, Hollywood, or the Riviera, they brought their chaos with them. Hotel managers braced for shouting matches. Party guests watched them unravel in real time. Zelda once threw herself down a staircase during a fight, while Scott would insult her in front of strangers and then demand she act like nothing happened. The drama wasn't hidden. It was part of their public persona. They became known as the couple who drank too much, fought too loud, and loved too fiercely. For them, the line between love and war blurred fast. But underneath it all was a shared hunger for validation. Both Zelda and Scott came from places that told them they weren't quite enough. Zelda for her ambition in a world that wanted Southern women to behave, and Scott for his insecurity about status and class. They clung to each other with a desperation that looked like passion, but often played out as sabotage. When Scott drank, which was often, he turned cruel. When Zelda felt ignored, she acted out, flirting with other men or dressing in ways that would provoke a reaction. They knew exactly how to hurt each other, and they did it often. Once, during a party, Zelda locked herself in a bathroom and refused to come out unless Scott admitted he was nothing without her. Another time, Scott accused her of being crazy in front of their friends, long before mental illness was ever diagnosed. Their fights became fuel for gossip columns, and they seemed to care more about being talked about than being okay. In their world, silence was scarier than scandal. What kept them together wasn't peace. It was a mix of pride, addiction, and dependence. They were both drinking heavily by the early 1920s, and alcohol didn't just dull their pain. It gave them permission to say the things they'd been holding back. Scott would lash out about her ruining his life, and Zelda would fire back that he was afraid of her talent. The more they drank, the more those ugly truths spilled out, until even their friends started to avoid them. And still, they stayed. Divorce was never on the table, not seriously. They lived apart at times and threatened separation, but something always pulled them back. Maybe it was the sense that no one else would understand them. Maybe it was the thrill of destruction, or maybe they were both too afraid to be irrelevant on their own. Their names had become one brand, Zelda and Scott, and neither was ready to break it apart, even if it was breaking them. What made their marriage so volatile was that both of them wanted the same thing: to be seen, heard, and remembered. But instead of lifting each other up, they constantly fought for space in the spotlight. And when one gained ground, the other felt erased. It was a marriage built not just on love, but on rivalry, and that rivalry didn't ease with time. They tried to present a united front to the world, but their private chaos leaked into every part of their lives. Their letters were filled with accusations and apologies. Their dinner conversations turned into shouting matches. When they weren't fighting, they were silent. And when they weren't silent, they were hurting each other. But leaving, that never seemed to cross their minds. It was as if they believed suffering together was a badge of honor, as if their toxic love proved how real it was. And when invitations to Europe came, it felt like a lifeline. Maybe a change of scenery would cool the fire. Maybe Paris could save what New York had nearly destroyed. But for Zelda and Scott, escape was never that simple. Paris, Picasso, and private wars. In the mid-1920s, Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald finally crossed the Atlantic and settled in Paris, hoping the city's energy would recharge their lives. They weren't alone. A whole wave of American artists and writers had already made the move, creating a wild intellectual crowd of expats that included Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and Ezra Pound. Paris was buzzing with ideas, arguments, and late-night cafes, and the Fitzgeralds were right in the middle of it. For Zelda, the move brought a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. Away from the pressures of New York society and Southern expectations, she began to carve out space for herself, one brushstroke at a time. She started painting seriously and developed a unique, vivid style. Her canvases were filled with bright colors and strange, dreamlike figures. The influence of modernist artists like Picasso, Matisse, and even Rousseau showed up in her work, but she didn't copy them. She absorbed and twisted their ideas into something entirely her own. You see, Zelda's art was deeply personal. Many of her pieces reflected her inner world, filled with strong, exaggerated female figures, theatrical poses, and hints of satire. It was clear she had something to say, and she was saying it with boldness. But the more Zelda found her voice on canvas, the more Scott grew uneasy. He had always been the star, the great American writer, the genius behind The Great Gatsby. But in Paris, that spotlight started to flicker. Hemingway, who was gaining popularity fast, didn't hide his dislike for Zelda. He saw her as a distraction, or worse, a threat to Scott's work. Scott, already drinking heavily and struggling with his second novel, leaned into Hemingway's version of events. He began to doubt Zelda's intentions, painting her as unstable and attention-seeking. What he couldn't admit, even to himself, was that her talent made him nervous. Zelda was creating her own identity as an artist. Scott had always mined their life for material, using her diaries, her phrases, even her letters to shape his characters. But now, Zelda was trying to write her own story, literally and figuratively. And that shift wasn't something he handled well. At the same time, Zelda had taken on a new obsession, ballet. She began training seriously, sometimes practicing for up to 8 hours a day. It started as a hobby, but in typical Zelda fashion, it quickly turned into something more intense. She had a stubborn, all-or-nothing personality, and ballet gave her both a physical outlet and a structure she could control. In the mornings, she painted. In the afternoon, she danced. And at night, she tried to navigate a social world that never felt fully hers. Scott, meanwhile, was sinking. He spent more time at the bar than at his desk. He fought with editors, missed deadlines, and pushed Zelda away when he wasn't clinging to her in desperation. Their fights became more frequent and more public. Friends started to notice how quickly things could spiral between them. One night, they'd be laughing over wine with Hemingway. The next, they'd be screaming at each other in a hotel hallway. Their home life was no more stable. In private, the cracks in their marriage were turning into full-blown fractures. Scott often accused Zelda of sabotaging his career. Zelda accused him of using her life for fiction while denying her any credit. The resentment ran deep. Every time Zelda tried to express herself, whether through art, dance, or writing, Scott found a way to criticize or dismiss it. It was jealousy. It was fear that if Zelda succeeded on her own, what did that say about the man who had built his image around being the genius in the relationship? Still, Zelda kept creating. She wrote short stories, some of which were published under Scott's name or with his heavy edits. She kept painting, even as critics and publishers ignored her. She kept dancing, even as her body began to ache. On the outside, they were still seen as the golden couple, young, beautiful, and tragic in a romantic way. But behind closed doors, they were living two different lives, each increasingly lonely. Their friends didn't help either. Hemingway, in particular, played a toxic role in deepening the divide. He treated Zelda with open hostility and encouraged Scott's worst instincts. Scott, always insecure about his masculinity and his place in the literary world, clung to Hemingway's approval like a lifeline. It was easier to believe Zelda was unstable than to face the possibility that she might be just as talented or even more daring than he was. Even their daughter Scotty saw less of her parents during this time. She was often left with nannies or family friends while Scott and Zelda spiraled deeper into their personal battles. The Fitzgeralds were no longer simply living the jazz age dream, they were unraveling in the middle of it, with Paris as their backdrop. As the pressure mounted, Zelda began withdrawing into herself. The city that had once inspired her started to feel claustrophobic. Her mind, always active, became harder to quiet, and her obsession with perfection, especially in ballet, took over everything else. She pushed her body past exhaustion, refusing to slow down even when the pain started. Their apartment, once filled with laughter and jazz records, grew tense and silent. The glamorous dinners became fewer, the invitations stopped coming, and the Fitzgeralds, once the center of every room they entered, became known for their absences more than their presence. Zelda's creative energy hadn't vanished, but the world around her, including her own husband, didn't know what to do with it. She was a woman ahead of her time, trying to find a place in a world that had only given her one role, muse. The problem was, Zelda had no interest in staying quiet. She wanted to be more than just someone else's inspiration. Her body was starting to break under the weight of that ambition, but her spirit hadn't given in just yet. Ballet and breakdown, a dream that shattered her health. At 27, Zelda Fitzgerald decided she wanted to become a professional ballerina. Most dancers start training when they're still kids. Zelda was already a wife, a mother, and a public figure. She had no formal background, no late-night rehearsals behind her, just a fierce obsession to master something on her own terms. Ballet wasn't a pastime. It was something she had clung to for some time now. She started training with even more focus that shut everything else out. Hours turned into days at the bar. Her feet bled, her muscles stiffened, and her body began to wear down. The more pain she felt, the harder she pushed. She didn't listen when people asked her to slow down. Not her friends, not Scott, not the doctors who saw the damage setting in. They warned her she was doing real harm. Her body was already fragile after years of pressure, public attention, and emotional strain. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. She needed discipline, structure, and solitude. Ballet became a way to reshape herself, to turn chaos into control. She believed she could push through anything. She stopped going out. She stopped smiling in photographs. The parties, the crowds, the magazine clippings, none of it seemed to matter anymore. She gave her days to ballet. Even when her body began failing, she kept going. Her hair thinned, her energy vanished. Still, she danced. In 1930, her health collapsed. Her body stopped responding, and her thoughts no longer lined up the way they used to. She stopped eating. Her sentences drifted. Her sense of self broke apart. Doctors called it a nervous breakdown. Scott arranged for her to be sent to a clinic in Switzerland. She left quietly. The woman who had once lit up every room slipped into silence. That hospital became the first in a long line. Over the next few years, she moved through clinics in Europe and the United States. She went from guest lists to patient charts. The names of her doctors replaced the names of friends. She was studied, medicated, and written about in reports instead of newspapers. Inside those walls, life took on a different shape. Long hours of silence, therapy sessions, pills that dulled her sharp edges. She was often labeled schizophrenic. Today, some question whether that diagnosis was accurate, but at the time it was treated as fact. She didn't respond well to confinement, but she rarely protested. Her energy was gone. The woman people once described as electric was now often motionless. Scott visited sometimes. He wrote. He sent money when he could. Their relationship had changed. They weren't partners anymore. They were two people trying to make sense of what had happened to them. His drinking had worsened. His career was in decline. She lived in clinics. They communicated through nurses and letters. In the hospital, Zelda kept a routine: meals, therapy, rest. She painted when allowed. She read. She wrote letters that sometimes rambled and sometimes made perfect sense. Her mind still held color, but it came in flashes. Some days she believed she was improving. Other days she fell back into silence. The world outside moved forward. New writers emerged. The glamour of the jazz age faded. The Fitzgerald name wasn't as celebrated as it once was. Zelda became a whisper in the story instead of the headline. People remembered her, but mostly as a cautionary tale or a name in someone else's biography. Her dream of ballet ended. Her body couldn't take it anymore. The damage was too deep. Still, she never fully let go of it. In her sketches and paintings, ballerinas kept showing up. They were graceful, poised, always just out of reach. They were versions of the person she had once imagined she could be. As the decade wore on, Zelda's world shrank. Fewer visitors, fewer mentions. Her days became quieter. People talked about her like she was gone, even when she was still alive. Some blamed her for what had happened. Others pitied her. But no one really knew how she felt. She didn't explain it. She rarely had the chance to. There were moments of clarity. She sent letters filled with insight. She had short visits with her daughter, Scotty. She painted with care and detail. There were sparks of the woman she had been. She never fully disappeared. The hospitals became her world, but they didn't erase her imagination. She stayed in institutions for the rest of her life. Each stay left her further away from the person people once knew, but her creativity never left her completely. It lived in her art, in her words, in the quiet effort to stay connected to herself. Even when everything else faded, she held on to that. A voice of her own, writing "Save Me the Waltz." But in the early 1930s, something changed. During her stay at the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic in Baltimore, Zelda did something no one around her had expected. She wrote a novel. She called it "Save Me the Waltz." It was emotional, chaotic, and urgent. She worked on it constantly, filling page after page during her treatment. The story followed Alabama Beggs, a character shaped from Zelda's own life. Alabama was restless, deeply ambitious, and always trying to prove she was more than what people saw. She chased meaning through dance, marriage, and art, often clashing with the world around her. The writing was intense. Zelda's sentences twisted and tangled, her metaphors came quickly, and her tone shifted without warning. But the book held something real. She had taken her pain, confusion, and memories and turned them into fiction. For the first time, the story was hers. Not filtered through someone else's style, not shaped by Scott's edits or voice. It was her version. Scott was furious when he found out. He believed Zelda had used material from their marriage that he planned to include in his own work. He said she had crossed a line, and he worried her book would come out before his next one. When he read it, he demanded changes. He said parts of it were too revealing. Zelda, still recovering, agreed to some of the edits. She even dedicated the book to him, but her voice was still there, strong and clear beneath the revisions. When it was published in 1932 by Scribner's, the reaction was mixed. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some said the writing was clumsy or too experimental. Others saw glimpses of something original and bold. Most readers didn't buy it. Sales were low, and it was never heavily promoted. But it existed. Zelda had written it. That mattered. The title, "Save Me the Waltz," said everything. In Zelda's life, dance had always been a form of escape. The waltz wasn't just about beauty, it was about staying upright when everything else was falling. The story of Alabama Beggs held Zelda's frustrations, her longing for recognition, and her struggle to hold on to her creative life. After the novel's release, Zelda tried to write more. She started a second book but didn't finish it. Her mental health got worse, and her thoughts became harder to organize. But the act of writing "Save Me the Waltz" had given her a moment of clarity. She had told her story the way she wanted to. Although Scott never accepted the book remained a turning point. Zelda had put her experience into words. She had described what it felt like to live in someone else's shadow, to want something bigger, and to fall apart in the process. Her language didn't follow the rules. Her ideas moved quickly and without warning, but that was how her mind worked. The novel showed it all. However, in the years that followed, Save Me the Waltz faded from bookstores. It didn't get reprinted or widely studied, but Zelda had written it. It sat on a shelf with her name on the spine. For someone constantly told who she was, that act meant everything. The final split, losses that couldn't be rewritten. By the late 1930s, Scott Fitzgerald's health had worsened. Years of drinking, disappointments, and money problems had worn him down. His reputation as a great writer was slipping. Publishers weren't excited about his work anymore. Magazines stopped asking for his short stories. He was trying to finish a novel that kept dragging on. To make ends meet, he took screenwriting jobs in Hollywood. He was no longer the rising star of American literature. He was tired, sick, and struggling. At the same time, Zelda was being transferred between psychiatric hospitals across the country. Her life had become a series of hospital stays, unfamiliar routines, and isolation. She wasn't surrounded by friends or family. Her days were quiet and repetitive. She wrote letters that showed confusion, sadness, and a desire to be heard. Most people didn't reply. The woman who once lit up rooms with her presence now spent her days behind closed doors. Their daughter, Scotty, was growing up in the middle of it all. She was sent from school to school and often lived with caretakers. She visited her parents sometimes, but those visits didn't fix much. She was the only person still connected to both of them. Messages were passed through her now and then. But the conversations between Scott and Zelda had mostly stopped. The connection they once had was fading. Scott's life in California was quiet and uneventful. He was living in a small apartment and dating a gossip columnist. He was working on a novel about Hollywood, but he wasn't getting far. His health kept getting worse. He had heart problems. He was weak and often stayed in bed. In December 1940, while reading and eating a candy bar, he suddenly collapsed. He died of a heart attack. He was only 44. Zelda got the news while staying in a hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. She wasn't there when he died and didn't go to the funeral. They hadn't lived together for years. Their marriage had fallen apart slowly. There were no dramatic final moments. Their relationship had faded into silence. What remained was the memory of who they used to be and their daughter, who now carried that memory alone. In the 1920s, Scott and Zelda had been everywhere. Their photos were in newspapers. Their names were always in the headlines. People followed their every move. But by the time Scott died, that attention had disappeared. He was buried in Rockville, Maryland, in a borrowed grave. His name wasn't even carved into the stone at first. There was no crowd, no ceremony, no public tribute. The people who once celebrated him had already moved on. Zelda felt the loss deeply. Even though they hadn't been close, she still felt his presence in the world. Now that was gone. There would be no more letters, no more unexpected messages, no chance of seeing him again. The chapter they had written together had ended without warning. It didn't end with closure, it just stopped. Their old friends were distant. Ernest Hemingway, who never liked Zelda, mocked both of them in his writing. Others who once called them brilliant had stopped checking in. The two people who had once stood at the center of a generation were no longer part of the story. Their names weren't mentioned much anymore. They had become a reminder of what could go wrong. Scott's books weren't popular at the time. The Great Gatsby had barely sold. He died thinking his work had failed. No awards or recognition were waiting for him. His books were out of print. His name wasn't in the classroom. Zelda's name had faded too. She wasn't remembered as an artist or a writer. She wasn't mentioned at all. Zelda now had to face a world without Scott, navigating her final years largely forgotten by the world that once adored her. Shadows and Silence. Her life after Scott. After Scott, Zelda Fitzgerald lived away from the public eye. The jazz age had passed, and people stopped following the lives of the Fitzgeralds. Zelda spent her remaining years in psychiatric hospitals where her days were quiet and structured. She stayed in several institutions, with Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, becoming the main one. The hospital routines were strict, and the days were often the same. Zelda passed the time by painting and writing. Her art was colorful and full of movement. The images she created had a dreamlike feel. She filled sketchbooks with scenes that looked like memories and emotions blended together. Her writing continued in journals, notebooks, and scraps of paper. She started a second novel called Caesar's Things. She worked on it off and on, but it was never finished. The story never came together fully, and no publisher picked it up. She still kept writing. She used it as a way to stay focused and keep her mind active. She didn't write for an audience. She wrote because it gave her something to do and something to care about. Zelda's days were quiet and repetitive. Meals, therapy sessions, and long hours filled the time. Some days she talked with the nurses and visitors. Other days, she said very little. Her thoughts moved between memories, plans, and imagination. Her behavior was not always predictable. Doctors and staff didn't always understand her. Mental health care during this time was limited, and many patients like Zelda were misunderstood. Her daughter, Scotty, stayed in touch. She wrote letters and checked on her mother from afar. Some old friends reached out or came to visit. These moments gave Zelda something to look forward to. She still cared about people from her past, even if those relationships had changed. Zelda kept personal objects and art in her room. She drew pictures of ballrooms, flowers, and dancers. She painted scenes from her younger days. She added color to the white walls and filled empty space with things from her memory. She tried to hold on to parts of her past through her art. People who saw her in those years said she seemed calm. She spoke gently, dressed neatly, and often looked thoughtful. Some expected her to be more distant or agitated, but she didn't act that way. She carried herself with care. Her voice was quiet, and her movements were careful. She acted like someone who was used to the silence. By the mid-1940s, she stayed at Highland Hospital full-time. She no longer moved between places. The outside world kept changing, but Zelda stayed in the same rooms and followed the same routines. New books came out. New music played on the radio. Zelda lived away from all of it. But then, in a twist no one expected, the story ended in fire. Trapped in flames, Zelda's tragic end. On the night of March 10, 1948, a fire started in the hospital's kitchen just before midnight. It began as a small blaze, but the building was old and not equipped to handle emergencies. The fire spread quickly, climbing up the wooden structure and through the halls. There were no alarms or sprinklers. Most of the staff did not know how to respond. Zelda was locked in a room on the upper floor scheduled for electrotherapy. The hospital had placed her there for the night. As the fire moved, smoke filled the corridors. Staff scrambled to find keys, but they couldn't move fast enough. Firefighters arrived to the thick smoke and heat. By the time they reached her floor, the damage was too severe. 9 women died that night. Zelda was among them. Her body was found in the rubble of the locked room. The fire had destroyed everything. There was no way to identify her by appearance. The woman who once drew crowds, headlines, and attention had died in a room that no one could reach. The fire left behind a bleak scene. Survivors described hearing cries from locked rooms and the sound of walls breaking apart. Some women tried to hide. Others never woke up. Zelda had lived through years of pressure, illness, and failed dreams. Her life ended not in a grand moment, but in a locked room that no one could open in time. The world outside barely noticed. A few short articles appeared in local newspapers. There were no front-page headlines, no literary tributes. Her death was treated like a footnote. People who had once known her didn't speak about it. No one asked questions about the hospital's safety or the way patients were treated. There were no major investigations. Her passing came and went without much attention. Her death marked the end of a life that had shifted far from where it began. Zelda had once been a name that filled conversations. She stood out in every room, Her writing, her dancing, her presence drew people in. Over time, her world narrowed. By the 1940s, many had forgotten she was still alive. Few knew she was at Highland. There were no visitors, no reporters, no updates on her health. She had faded into the background. Reclaiming Zelda from muse to legend. For most of the 20th century, Zelda Fitzgerald's name was tied to her husband's. She was often described as the glamorous flapper, the troubled wife, or the woman who followed F. Scott Fitzgerald into chaos. Her life was mentioned in connection with his and rarely explored on its own. But in the 1970s and 1980s, that began to change. Writers, scholars, and feminists started revisiting Zelda's story. They looked beyond the image of her as someone who interrupted Scott's career or faded into mental illness. They looked at her letters, her art, and her writing, and began to recognize a creative woman who had spent much of her life trying to be seen and heard. Zelda's novel, Save Me the Waltz, was one of the first pieces to draw attention. It had been largely forgotten after its release in 1932, when it received negative reviews and was criticized for overlapping with Scott's work. When readers and critics gave it another look decades later, they found a story that spoke openly about the challenges Zelda faced. The novel gave a detailed and emotional account of a woman trying to find space for her ambitions inside a marriage and a society that left little room for her voice. It wasn't just a reflection of her life. It was an attempt to shape it on her own terms. Around the same time, people began to learn more about her art. While living in hospitals, Zelda had turned to painting. She filled notebooks and canvases with watercolors that were expressive, colorful, and full of movement. Her artwork had gone unnoticed for years, but it eventually made its way into galleries in major cities. Viewers saw the thought and care in her brushstrokes. Her paintings captured characters from literature, fairy tales, and her own imagination. Her story reached new audiences through film and television, too. In 2017, Christina Ricci played her in the series Z, The Beginning of Everything. This version of Zelda wasn't a side character. She was given a full personality, a sense of humor, and moments of strength. Theater companies also started writing and performing plays based on her letters and journals. Audiences were hearing her own words, sometimes funny, sometimes frustrated, but always thoughtful. The hard parts of Zelda's life never disappeared from the story. She spent years in and out of mental hospitals. Her marriage was filled with arguments, competition, and disappointment. She died in a fire while living in a hospital. But when people read her words and looked at her work, they began to see the full picture. She hadn't just broken down. She had also built things, paintings, stories, and ideas that lasted long after she was gone. Today, her name appears in books, courses, and museum exhibits. In Montgomery, Alabama, the home she once lived in has been turned into a museum. Visitors walk through rooms that hold her art, her writing, and pieces of her daily life. They get a sense of the person she was, not just the stories that were told about her. What makes Zelda's story powerful today is not just that she was misunderstood, but that she was rediscovered. For decades, her voice was buried under Scott's fame, her creativity dismissed as a distraction or overshadowed by her illness. But when readers, artists, and historians began to look closer, they uncovered a woman who had been fighting to define herself all along. Zelda was not simply the first flapper, a charming figure in sparkling gowns, or the tragic wife of a great novelist. She was an artist who painted with bold colors, who wrote with urgency, and who lived with a hunger for meaning. Her struggles were real: mental illness, the strain of marriage, the weight of expectations, but so was her resilience. She found ways to create in the middle of hospitals, in the quiet of exile, and in the shadow of a world that told her to shrink. That's why her legacy matters, because it reminds us that history has a way of pushing aside voices it doesn't understand. But silenced voices never truly vanish. They wait, in journals, in brushstrokes, in hidden manuscripts, until someone is willing to listen. Zelda Fitzgerald is now known as more than a name in someone else's biography. She is remembered as someone who had talent, drive, and a need to express herself, even when the world around her didn't know how to listen. And there you have it, the wild, brilliant, and heartbreaking life of Zelda Fitzgerald. If you thought F. Scott was the star of the show, think again. Zelda lived louder, loved harder, and burned twice as bright. Hit that like button if her story blew your mind, drop a comment on whether she was a muse or a misused genius, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got more forgotten icons and hidden histories coming your way. See you in the next one.